With the temperature outside hovering around freezing, it's probably quite a good time to look back at the summer and to examine the preliminary results from Garden BirdWatch butterfly surveying. We first started recording butterflies through Garden BirdWatch in 2003 when we did a pilot study, and we now treat them in exactly the same way as birds. Roughly half of our observers are submitting butterfly records on paper forms, the other half online. And the number of records we've received for 2010 is just under 95,000. So it's a staggering amount of information that's coming in. This information comes from about 2,500 sites submitting through the online system. And of course, they're the ones that we're using when we're talking about these preliminary analyses, because the paper forms aren't sent back until the end of the year. So in effect, we're probably expecting to receive records from about 5,000 gardens for 2010 once we've got it all in the system. In terms of the actual numbers of gardens submitting throughout the course of the year, we peak at about 1,500 gardens submitting online in any given week. And that figure for 2010 is very similar to what we saw last year. So what about the results? What have we seen? This table shows the occurrence, or the relative occurrence, of different butterfly species in Garden BirdWatch gardens. And it's for the 14 most commonly reported species. And you can see that the most frequently recorded species in both years was large white, and that a number of other familiar species are here as well. And it's interesting, if you compare the figures from 2009 with those from 2010, for most of the species they're pretty similar. And that might reflect the fact that many of these butterflies are actually quite common, they're quite widespread, and so we are going to see them in gardens. And of course, towards the end of the year, when we look at the data in more detail, we'll be able to look at the actual numbers seen in gardens, and we might see some interesting differences there. There are two species, however, within this table that actually there has been quite a change in their occurrence between 2009 and 2010. Painted lady butterfly has dropped from 69% of gardens in 2009 to 18% this year. And that really reflects the fact that during 2009 we had this massive immigration of this species from continental Europe, wave upon wave of them coming through the country, as many observers noted. And so this year it's almost as if numbers have dropped that down to more normal levels. The other species where there's a substantial change is holly blue. And we've seen an increase from 27% of gardens last year to just under 41% of gardens this year. Now, the holly blue is a familiar butterfly across much of southern Britain and Ireland, and its populations tend to cycle over time. And this change in population size seems to be linked partly to weather, but also because of parasitoid populations, small parasitoid wasps that lay their eggs in holly blue caterpillars, and they can have quite an impact on the population. So we'll have a boom year with lots of holly blues, which is very good for the parasitoid wasps, and that then has a knock-on effect and takes the population back over time. So certainly once we get a bit more of a longer run of GBW data for butterflies, we should start to see this cyclical pattern coming through. I want to show you one other little bit from the data that we've collected, and that's to do with the timing of butterfly flight patterns. So here are some data for peacock butterfly. Again, web submissions collected through Garden BirdWatch. And this might look like a little bit of a complicated figure, but what we have along the bottom here is the week number going through the year from week 1 through to week 52. And up the side we have latitude. So the further up you go, the further north. And to get some idea of where you are in the country, I've just put a map alongside here which shows you the position of London and the position of Glasgow. So let's take those away again so it's a bit easier for you to see what's going on. So each of these dots on the map represents what we saw for peacocks at a point in time, i.e. a week, and a point in space, a latitude. And the stronger the colour of the dot, the greater the occurrence of peacocks in gardens. So what we can see is a few dots early in the year that are presumably peacocks that have been disturbed from hibernation, because this is one of the few species that overwinters as an adult. Then we get the main emergence towards the end of March, and you can see these individuals on the wing, hence lots of dots through this period. It then goes a little bit quiet, and that's because this generation has died, and what we have now are eggs and caterpillars that form the next generation, which is itself on the wing from about week 30, so sort of July time. And the other interesting thing to note here is that the further north that you go, the greater the latitude, the later things seem to happen. And of course, many of you will be familiar with the fact that spring really gets a little bit later the further north you are. The emergence of the daffodils, the first bud burst, is always a few weeks later. And that's what you would also expect to see for butterflies. They are emerging slightly later. It takes them longer to get through the caterpillar stage and egg stage to become an adult. And interestingly, for some species, you will find that the butterfly has two broods in the south of the country, but as you move north towards Scotland, it becomes single brooded. And that really is to do with this sort of contraction in the length of the season. So that's really just a glance at some of the results from Garden BirdWatch butterfly data, the first ones in through the web, and we'll be publishing more on this next year.